Tamron's 28-75mm f2.8 is a really interesting lens. I think this lens is brilliant for the sort of people that want to jump up to a fixed aperture zoom lens but don't want to spend the money that you might with Canon's 24-70 or something along those lines. Now, I bought this lens when I first got my 5D Mark III because I'd just spent a lot of money on the camera body and decided I needed a fixed aperture zoom lens. And I've really enjoyed using this lens, and I'll get into some of the things I like about it now. The first thing I want to talk about is build quality. Build quality matters a lot to me. I tend to throw my equipment around a bit, not necessarily because I'm not being careful with it, but just because it gets used, and this lens really does not disappoint in the build quality department. To start off with, the lens has a really nice focus ring. If you're interested in doing video, that's really useful. The focus throw is quite short, but that's actually not a bad thing because it means you can go from infinity to its closest focusing distance really quickly. Particularly if you're into a sort of guerrilla filmmaking style, that can be really useful because you can track your subject moving from near to far very easily. To talk a bit more about the other rings on this lens, the zoom ring is quite heavy. It's quite a sort of, I suppose, sticky feeling zoom ring, which I haven't ever liked that much. It feels like it's getting caught on things, and it might just be my sample of the lens, but I'm not sure. Another really useful thing about this lens is that it has a lockout underneath, which means you can fix the lens at 28mm, and I think that's really useful, especially if you're travelling with the lens and you've got your camera hanging down by your side, for instance, and you don't want it to creep forward and extend to its full 75mm. I found it's really useful as well when it's in a camera bag, because it means that when you're lifting the lens out like that, you don't end up with the lens hood or the lens cap getting stuck in the bottom of the bag. To talk a bit about the weight and size of the lens, I must admit I'm actually really impressed. I bought this lens on the internet not knowing masses about it, but it arrived and it's a really heavy and nice feeling lens. It actually feels really good attached to even a professional body like my 5D Mark III, which I think is really good. The size of this lens is really nice as well because it's a bit smaller than the 24-70s that the first party manufacturers make, which means that it's not quite as standout and it's easier to travel with. If you're bothered about looks, this lens is actually really nice because it might be more than 20 years old, but it actually doesn't look that old. It looks like quite a modern bit of glass. I think this is largely down to the fact that Tamron haven't really changed their designs all that much, but I still think it looks very nice even today. The second thing I really want to talk about is the image quality and the optics of this lens. Obviously, when you're buying a lens, that's the number one thing to consider. Is it going to be sharp and is it going to fulfill my needs? And actually, I'm quite impressed by this lens. For a sub £200 lens here in the UK, I think it actually pulls it off very decently. If I did have a criticism to make about this lens, it's the fact that at 28mm it isn't razor sharp. Now, take that with a pinch of salt because I'm comparing it to lenses that are 5 or 6 times its value. But when you're shooting at f2.8 at 28mm, it's a bit hazy and a bit soft, which I find a little bit annoying. Obviously, I say take that with a pinch of salt, because it is a sub £200 lens, and you can't expect L lens results from a lens that's quite so cheap. Some positive news, however, is that from a chromatic aberration point of view, this lens is almost perfect. You get some occasional green fringing, but that's really it. I'm actually very impressed with the internal optical design of this lens as far as chromatic aberrations are concerned. Another thing people are particularly bothered about, and I'm never quite sure why, but it's vignetting. Vignetting, obviously, you can very easily fix with the likes of Photoshop and Lightroom and goodness knows what editing software. But this lens is actually very good. It has a very little sort of natural vignette when you're right out at 2.8 and 28mm. I actually think it's quite nice. It's quite a nice effect, but it's worth bearing in mind if you're, for some reason, into shooting white walls and care that much about vignetting. The last thing I want to say about optics is the fact that this lens has a slightly weird focal length. Obviously it's in the market of the 24-70s from Sigma, Canon, Nikon, any number of companies, and the fact that it's 28mm to 75mm is a bit odd. I like the fact that it's 75mm at the long end because any extra reach is always great, but not having 24 at the wide end, I think that's really weird. I think that's a really weird design choice because now that I've switched over to 24-70s, I noticed so much more that the extra 4mm makes quite a big difference, and I do find myself missing it if I ever use the Tamron. I wanted to say a few things about autofocus, because the trend with modern lenses is to keep making them quieter and faster. This lens definitely isn't going to win any speed competitions, nor is it going to be any good for shooting in quiet environments. The autofocus is okay, I'll say that at first. It does the job, but it does so with quite a good bit of whirring. It's quite a high-pitched, whiny whir. And I think it's fine. I've even used it in quiet sort of concert environments and it's not been a problem. But I think if you're into shooting video, for instance, with autofocus, say you have a 70 or an 80D, or one of the new cameras anyway with dual pixel AF, I think you'll probably want to keep it on manual focus because the autofocus is quite loud. There is one positive thing to say about the autofocus though, and it's that it's really accurate. My particular model, and obviously this can vary model by model, but my model personally has been really, really accurate. I've never had any problems. Obviously that's less of a problem these days because you can just use the autofocus fine-tuning and hone it in to make sure it's perfectly sharp. But my model has been brilliant with autofocus. I haven't had any problems at all. Nearing the end of the video then, I wanted to show you a couple of images that I've taken. Obviously, you're going to have to take these with a pinch of salt because I've edited them in my own style. I tend to apply a bit of grain to images because it's an effect that I quite like, which is really just a disclaimer. I haven't put any sharpening on the images, so what you see is what you get as far as that's concerned. To come to a conclusion then, I used this lens intensively for about a year, and I actually really enjoyed doing that. It's a really versatile lens, and whilst it isn't always perfectly sharp, as I mentioned before, when you're at the wide end at 2.8, it's a little bit hazy. But if you stop it down to f4 and you zoom in or zoom out, everything is perfectly sharp. I really could not ask for any more. I think for what it cost me, it does a really, really good job, and I've really enjoyed using it. If I had to sell this lens to a person, I would suggest it's ideal for someone who's just moved to full frame, or is shooting on a crop and wants a slightly more professional lens with a fixed aperture. I think it does a really, really good job for all of that, and if you're willing to deal with some of the trade-offs of it being a little bit cheaper, some of the haziness and the loud autofocus, I really don't think you can go wrong. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll drop my Instagram at the end of the video, and you can go and check me out over there. Thank you.